Hello, all of my fellow language learners out there. My name is Joshua, and today I have the amazing opportunity to have a conversation with Mireya Pérez. And she is a language professional, and she is also the host of the Brand the Interpreter podcast. So please, Mireya, could you just talk a little bit about where you are from and how was it growing up there?
Yes, thank you. Well, first and foremost, I just want to say thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be able to be in different platforms to talk a little bit about my story, of course, but just connecting with other individuals out there. So I appreciate the invitation. I'll begin by sharing that I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. So I'm full, like 100% full-blown Californian. It is true. We do get cold as soon as it gets anything below 70 degrees Fahrenheit out here. So all those rumors are definitely true, I can tell you. I was born in Los Angeles up and raised there until the age of around, I want to say 10 or 11. We moved briefly to the high desert. It's called the high desert. And then we moved back to LA. So there was a lot of moving back and forth as a kid. But definitely, I stayed in LA for quite a few years of my life, the majority of my childhood. And then there was a lot of movement after that until my adulthood. So I ended up in Temecula, so not too far from LA and not too far from San Diego.
Very nice. And what was your native language?
I was actually, my parents spoke Spanish. So I grew up speaking Spanish, and then I started school, preschool at a very young age, and no one there. The teachers didn't speak Spanish, so I quickly learned, as does the mind of a young child, quickly absorbed another language in order to be able to communicate my needs. So apparently that was just, that just comes second nature to children at the age of 4 in preschool, quite young, and I picked up the English language at school.
Wow.
Yeah.
And if you remember, was it very challenging to learn English at that age?
I don't remember if it was a challenge, so I'm going to safely assume that it was not. I do remember communicating well with my teachers and with my peers. So, and it was pretty diverse, which was also another thing that was beautiful about growing up in LA, is that we were in a pretty diverse little preschool, little school setting before I went off into elementary school. And so I think at a young age, I just began using or understanding that in one setting it was one language, and in another setting it was going to be my default language at the time, which was Spanish with my parents. In addition to, I must credit, and I always try to credit because it's the truth, my father was very strict with regards to the languages that were utilized at home. And so even though he spoke English, he wanted to make sure that I did not lose my Spanish, as he called it. He says, I may not have money to leave you, but I do have my language, and you're going to keep that. That's going to be basically like, that's what you're going to inherit, no riches, but you do get to carry on the language. And so he was adamant about me not responding in English whenever he spoke. He spoke with me, and if I tried to say, Dad, right, he'd say, no, 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 háblame en español, speak Spanish to me. Yeah.
Wow, that is very beautiful.
Yeah.
And did you learn any other languages?
I did not. In my heart, I always thought I would, but I suppose that life kind of took me in directions that had to do with languages, but I never really learned any other language unless sarcasm is included, but that's about it.
I
That
say
was
so.
among family members. But no, I didn't. I didn't learn any language. I was always interested in potentially getting into ASL. I thought that potentially that would be the language. I took French in high school and hated it. I knew that was definitely not going to be the language. And so I just thought, I think one day I'm going to learn how to speak ASL, and then I never followed through. So it's two languages, and let me tell you that just with two languages, it's difficult enough navigating through both. So that does it for me.
And was it a challenge trying to balance both of these languages, English and Spanish, as you were growing up?
I didn't realize that it was as challenging as it turned out to be, and I'm going to share why. Growing up in LA and growing up with in the beginning of my experience in school, we had a bilingual program. And so it felt so natural that I was bilingual and that the public education system in which I was in was bilingual. I just thought that's how the world functioned, that the world was bilingual. And it just so happened to be that in the area where I was, it was English, Spanish. Those were the two languages that were spoken. Everything seemed natural. I think I understood that in school, I spoke English, and not because we were instructed to, but because that was just natural for us at school. And then at home, I spoke Spanish. It wasn't until we left that setting and moved into the high desert, which was culture shock for someone from Los Angeles, where there was a tortilleria across the street from where we lived. I could literally cross the street from our home in LA, and everyone knew me there, right? They called me La Güera. I would walk in and, oh, La Güera's here, and I'd get a little packet of tortillas from my mom, and then I'd go back, and it was completely different moving to the high desert. Specifically, I'm going to mention it. We moved to this place called Apple Valley. There were no apples, no apple trees anywhere. Bunch of tumbleweeds all over the place. Lots and lots of empty land. So it was the desert, right? And so it was like empty land, completely different to my experience in Los Angeles. And that's where I ultimately realized that the world was not the same, that it was completely different. It was just a unique experience. I think, like I mentioned earlier, I thought the world spoke in at least two languages. And then I get to the school setting there and realize I was placed in something called, now I know what it is, but I was placed in a program called special education. And it was because they didn't have English as a second language, or not ESL, ELD, English language development. Because coming from bilingual program into this new school setting, they didn't have program for English learners, which for whatever reason that was still my classification. I was considered an English learner. And this school district didn't have it. And so the next best thing was special education. So I was placed in a special education classroom. And that was my introduction to how different the world worked outside of where I grew up when it came to languages, where in one setting, it was great to speak two languages, and in another setting, it was almost looked down upon that you spoke another language. And so that was interesting. I was pretty young when that happened to me, and that's when I realized, okay, this is different. This is different. Mm-hmm.
And then, just so I'm clear, so when you moved outside of LA, you were mostly everybody was speaking English, or everybody was mostly speaking Spanish?
No, when I moved out of LA, everyone was English speaking only.
English speaking only, okay.
Yes, the community that we moved into, our home was the second Latino home. The other household, the other family that lived in that neighborhood, they were from El Salvador. We were the first Mexican family of Mexican heritage that moved into the community. Everyone else was white. Mm-hmm. So it was culture shock, and I had one black friend, and I can call him friend. He was my bus buddy. We were the only two non-white students on that bus that went to school. And so it was yeah, it was just a culture shock, completely different to growing up in LA for me.
And let's talk a little bit about how you, like from this experience here, how you progressed into your language profession career.
I mean, I suppose that it was almost intentional, but at the same time, not intentional. Um, it it really was out of a desire to be able to utilize the skill set that I thought was the only skill that I had, right? So I couldn't really figure out or pinpoint professionally where I belonged. There were a lot of things that interested me, but I couldn't really pinpoint what I wanted to be when I grew up. I envied the people that knew exactly what they wanted to do after their high school experience and into college, and knew what they wanted to do and what they wanted to study. And I couldn't figure it out for the longest time. I often think back of an experience of having gone to court. We were in traffic court, and I had gone with my mother because most of us that grow up in bilingual household, particularly the oldest one, tends to be by default the family interpreter. And so I was taken to court with mother to be her interpreter. And hard as I tried, and as bilingual as I thought I was at that age, I was around 15, I realized I did not understand, or rather I could not transfer the message from the judge to my mother because I didn't understand the jargon. I couldn't translate. I couldn't interpret what was being said. And he was actually a really great person because he's the one that sort of instilled maybe the seed of curiosity as to how I could utilize my language professionally, because he basically said, how old are you, young lady? And I said, I'm 14, 15, whatever age I was. And he said, well, I appreciate you trying to help your mother in her native language, but we do have professional court interpreters, and we will call one for her at this time. Perhaps that's something you'd like to consider. So today,
Wow.
he was grateful, right? Like he called in the professional interpreter, but then kind of threw that seed in there. So I often think back about that experience because it was like, interpreting, really? Like that's what I'm, English, Spanish, that's what I'm going to be when I grow up, right? And I dismissed it at the time, but then life has a way of saying, you full circle come right back into how about this again. So I think by the second time that it came across my career path, I thought, okay, I think this is something I need to take seriously. And let me tell you, yes, it is not, oh, I speak two languages, that's too easy, it's non-challenging. That was not at all the experience, not at all.
Okay. And were you in the court the second time when the interpreter was there?
I was sitting there, yes, actually.
Okay.
I was sitting there as she walked in. This happened to be a female, and as she walked in to work with my mother. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I just asked because, maybe that helped to kind of plant the seed even more so you're able to actually see that in action, see an interpreter, doing their job. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, she was the individual was a complete professional, walked in, she looked sharp. I could not distinguish her from the attorneys that were there because she came in professionally dressed. And I do remember thinking, wow, okay, like that's, she doesn't look like I do in my jeans and t-shirt, it's like someone that they grabbed from the hallways. So yeah, definitely the visual image, thank goodness, right, that she walked in very professionally dressed and very poised and absolutely complete professional, walked in, did her job, and then that was it. She was off to the next case. So I didn't get the opportunity to speak with her, unfortunately, but or hear how to get started. But I do recall as we were leaving, there was this flyer posted in the courthouse a hallway that said, are you bilingual or something? It was like a poster recruiting for interpreters. But again, it just kind of stayed. We were there for something else. So I was kind of mixed in that drama with my mother. So I couldn't really think about it, but it came back around to my life.
Very nice. Yeah, the signs were there.
Yeah, totally, literally. And figuratively, yeah.
And could you also explain what exactly a language professional is?
Oh, yes. Thank you for that question. I'm sure there's a textbook definition out there somewhere, but I do feel that a language professional is someone who chooses, this is a choice that is made, an intentional choice, to utilize their languages, their combination of languages, because it could be more than two, excuse me. Utilize their combination of languages in an active, professional way, active, technical, as opposed to a passive way. And what I mean by that is that you make the decision to go through the schooling in order to be able to utilize your languages in a professional setting, as opposed to because you grew up or you learned another language and now you are assisting somebody communicate. I think there is a confusion out there as to what it takes to professionally interpret or to be a language professional. And ultimately, I come down to the fact that it is a choice by the individual to take themselves through schooling in order to be able to actively utilize their languages in a professional way.
Okay, wow. Well
Yeah.
explained.
It's a
So
long
yeah,
version. I'm sure there's a shorter textbook version out
no,
there.
that's perfect. Because I had no idea what a language professional was, a year ago. So for me, I feel like it's really important that everybody knows what that means.
Oh, wow. Yes. Well, welcome to the world of language professionals.
And yeah, let's continue with kind of your last point there. What was the process for you to become a language professional and to become an interpreter?
My personal experience, of course, everyone's experience differs, and I've come to find out absolutely on just the conversations that I get to have with other language professionals. But for the most part, for those that make that conscious decision of working with our language in a professional way, we do all tend to do the same thing, which is training. So for me personally, I had schools in mind that I really had a desire to attend. I had like choice one, choice two, and then the third choice for them, which is ultimately where I ended up going, only because the first two options were too expensive for me. So the very first one was the Monterey Institute of Languages, of International Languages, which is out. It's in California, but it's out in Monterey, California. I believe their name might have changed now. It might be something a little bit different. But that was in my heart where I wanted to attend from the get-go in order to do my training as a conference interpreter. Once I saw the price, I thought, okay, time to pivot because I can't afford it. So I figured I'm going to go to maybe the next best thing, which was the University of California of San Diego, right? And they have an extension program that offers the interpreting and translation program there. And so I thought I'm going to do court interpreting because, right, the story and all of that. So I thought I'm going to do legal interpreting. And then I looked at the price there and I thought, okay, maybe not. Maybe that's not going to be an option. Luckily, I say that, very, very consciously because I do feel fortunate enough that my local community college, which I didn't know, had an interpreting program. And they had what's called a community interpreting program, which is basically it services out in the community. So your social services, your school settings, your medical settings, things of that nature. And it was quite affordable, community college, compared to the other two where I had my heart set for in the beginning. So for me, it was a matter of absolutely looking into what fit not just my desire, but my pocketbook at the time. I was quite young and I was going to pay for school myself. So ultimately, I ended up going through the community college program, which took roughly nearly 2 years. I did go full time, so it took me a little bit less time than that, just because I completely devoted my day to that program. I knew that was what I wanted to do, especially once I got a taste of what it was like, and that it was really challenging, and that my Spanish that I grew up with at home was not going to get me A's through the program. Not at all, not at all. So once I hit that realization, I knew that I was where I was supposed to be. I knew it. I just felt like this is challenging. And I think that for any individual in anything that we do, when something is challenging us as a person mentally, right? Like we're just I feel like we enjoy the process more because it's like that opportunity for growth. So I ended up completing the program there.
Wow. And when you were making all these decisions on where you should go to actually, take this interpreting program or interpreting programs, did you have any mentor that was helping you make these decisions, or were you just kind of all on your own trying to figure things out?
That's such a great question, Joshua, because I did not have a mentor. I was alone through the process, and I often think back about that person, and that young me was the inspiration to creating the podcast, because I did feel lost and I couldn't find anyone's journeys to kind of match my journey and what I was going through at the time, in order to be able to decide if this is what I wanted to do or not. I do remember one time asking one of the professors at the school before I took, there is this, so okay, in high school, I'm gonna go back a little bit, and then I promise I'll circle back to your question. In high school, you're able to take, Spanish classes and stuff like that. So it's like, okay, I'll take some Spanish classes because it's an easy A, right? For us bilingual,
Yep.
like, English, Spanish, it's an easy A. Like, so I took the class, and then if you are going to college, you can transfer those credits. You can take this test that basically gives you the foreign language credits you need for your degree, right? And so that is your easy A. You transfer it or you test out. So for me, what I ended up doing was I go to college, and it's like I knew that I spoke Spanish, but I also knew that I didn't know the Spanish that they taught in school. That wasn't the Spanish we were taught at home, So I was kind of like, I wasn't sure what to do. And I remember asking a professor, and I said, would I be cheating myself if I take the test? I know I'm going to pass it because it's very basic level, but I also know that the stuff that once you get in school and you learn it, it's not something that we're taught growing up. I know how to read thanks to my parents, in Spanish, thanks to my parents, but I don't know all the grammar rules, and I didn't know, right? Like I didn't know any of those things that they teach you in class. And his response was so disappointing because it left me still, at a blank. And he was just like, I mean, that's your decision, right? And so I didn't really know still. I decided, like all young kids that want to hurry up and get done with things, especially their degree, to take the test. And I of course, and I say of course because like I said, I felt that I was bilingual enough to pass it, studious enough to do my due diligence and pass it. And so I ended up passing the program and did not have to take any Spanish classes. So when I finally go into my interpreting and translation, which are two different things, and we can get into that if you'd like, when I go into my classes, I realized that I had made a big mistake by not have taken the Spanish written courses, and all because I didn't know what the professors, like a drill sergeant, was talking about when it came to writing in the Spanish language. And so that was a wake up call for me, and realizing that there was no one I could really ask, because if you ask family that speaks Spanish, half of them don't even know that you could make this a profession, that there are professionals out there utilizing the languages. Everyone just figures if you're bilingual, like by default, you're an interpreter or a translator. So anyway, that was the long version of like, no, I didn't have a mentor. I was having to navigate things completely on my own, which unfortunately sometimes that means that you stumble and fall quite often until you figure out like, whoops, that, I think I should have gone this route.
Wow. And what would you say that you had to learn Spanish a lot when you were taking these courses still, just kind of like on the outside of those classes, or you had to kind of relearn a lot of different things, or you had to learn new things?
I had to learn different things and new things. I'd like to share that and it's my experience, but I've often have come to find out that it's the experience also of many. Our parents growing up, they don't get much schooling. So we're lucky if a lot of our parents finished elementary school. And sometimes that's later in elementary or, in the beginning years of elementary, because where our parents come from, schooling is different, at least back then. I don't know, I'm sure things might have changed now, but, and so there's a lot of things that although they would love to teach us, it's not that they don't want to, it's that they don't know how to. And so when I got to school and was going through these courses, I knew there was a lot that I didn't know. I knew that there was so much that there are things, Joshua, even like our parents pick up the American Spanish. If you believe me that there is such a thing, right? Because it's very guided by the English language. And so things such as parking, let's just say the word park in as in park your car, the word in Spanish is not, it's not what we utilize here in the States, which is parquear.
Okay.
But we grow up listening to our parents, voy a parquear el carro, which again is like car, which is not a Spanish word. Maybe now it's accepted here in the States, very much like a word. And so when you get to school and you're utilizing these Spanish words, the professors are like, get out of here. You do not speak Spanish. That is not Spanish. The proper word is estacionar, and it's vehículo or it's coche, depending on where you're at, and I'm like, what? And then I remember one time going back to my parents, and he said something about, voy a parquear el carro, I'm going to park the car. And I said, stop using those words. You've been lying to me all my life. I'm like, do you know the proper words? Yeah, but no one understands them here. So
Wow.
they end up picking it's madness when you grow up being bilingual in the States, let me tell you. But anyway, so the point there is that, I did have to navigate through those hoops and identify and be okay with the fact that I grew up with the Spanish that was not necessarily correct. It was very much regionalized here in the States, so that our parents could navigate through the system, because you're dealing with folks that are bilingual and that have an emphasis more in the English language, like myself, for instance, right? We speak English. We do have our other language, but then we kind of cross them. And so when people from Spanish-speaking countries come and they're dealing with customer service agents who are bilingual but that are crossing the languages, they're making up their own words. And so clients are like, maybe that's how they speak Spanish in the United States. So then they culturalize, right? They acclimate to that language and they begin utilizing that so that they're understood. Because if you use the word, such an easy word like estacionar, that customer service agent who thinks they're bilingual is like, what is that? That is not Spanish. Oh, you mean parquear? So yeah, I mean, I had to be okay with that. But I think that's another reason why I loved it so much, is because I realized, like, whoa, like the more I learn, the less I know, right? Who said that at some point, right? Like I realized that I didn't know anything. I didn't know as much as I thought I knew. So that just made the process much more enjoyable.
Okay. Wow. And how was the process from you graduating and then getting that first interpreting job?
That was hard. That was hard. Um, it was hard because that's another point in the process where there was no mentor again, right? And I had to figure out that there are people out in the world that are out there to make a quick buck and that are out there to take advantage, unfortunately. And it just so happened to be my luck, and I was naive in that setting. So when you come out from school, you've got options. You've got the option of working with an employer as an employee, getting hired full time. But you also have the option of freelancing. So you become an independent contractor, if you will, with different organizations as a language professional. They contract your services and you're able to work with them directly. In the language industry, there's also like a middleman. These are called language interpreting agencies or language service providers. So these are actual companies that are the middleman, exactly what they are. They'll bring in freelance interpreters, right, language professionals, and then they go out there and they find the contracts with the different companies that need the services. And these language service providers, not all of them are ethical. So I ended up with a company, unfortunately for me, as young as I was excited to be out there, but I didn't know what to look out for that would signify red flag, right? Red flag. And so this gentleman who called himself the owner of the agency picked me up, and I was like, hey, you can't just hire me as a bilingual person. I've got a degree, right? I've got the schooling behind me. You know, you've got to pay me a little different. So I thought I was smart by negotiating that. Yes. Long story short, it was I was short at the money. I worked and he never paid. So it was a learning lesson for me to realize that even as a professional coming out with the schooling behind me, that there was yet so much more to learn in the industry. And again, not knowing who to connect with, who was out there. It's funny because there are associations. There's one major association out there that I always thought were like, in comparison to me, these guys were like the language. It was that court interpreter that walked in that day, you know, I couldn't tell the difference between her and the attorney. To me, that was that level. And so I didn't realize that if only I had connected with an association or people in the associations, that somebody might have taken me under their wing and might have guided my journey. So instead, I took that long route and the difficult route of learning via fail, you know. So it was like I'd fall and I'd get back up and I'd fall and this isn't for me. Ultimately, I mean, I ended up getting hired with the hospital. So the experience was, you know, it wasn't all bad, but when I first started, it was difficult to say the least because I didn't know where to begin.
I see. And what made you get to the hospital as an interpreter? Is that something that you thought you were actually going to be doing when you got out of college, or no?
No, I had gone with my mindset that I was going to become a court interpreter. And I loved the terminology and I loved, you know, everything about it. And then when I was going through schooling, it was during the recession or economic recession that we were having back in 2008. And rather than seeing jobs out there in the market as I'm going through schooling, we started hearing that people were getting laid off from the court system. There were no jobs. There was a freeze and all this scary stuff. And in my mind, it was like, I collected all my pennies to go to school and there's going to be no jobs when I get out. And one of the instructor happened to have shared that there was a movement in the medical setting for medical interpreters that were certifying individuals that had gone through training and that were going to or could take a state exam, just like in the court setting, so that you can be a certified and become a certified medical interpreter because there was laws that had been passed with regards to the profession and who could interpret in medical settings, particularly in large hospital settings. And so, her recommendation was that we try both, even if our heart was set in court, that we continue to study and potentially even apply to get certified as medical interpreters. So based off of her recommendation, I continued pursuing trying to get medically certified until I did, and then ended up working first for a general hospital, and then I transitioned into a children's hospital.
And before you started that training, did you know a lot of medical terminology in Spanish? I guess in English too.
If we count the made up words, no, absolutely not. I think the technical jargon, which many people don't really think about, is a whole language in itself. Think about it, right? Even in English, in just one language, let's just keep it, basic. We go into or dive into some specialty, whether it's, let's say quantum physics, and they start nerding out amongst themselves. We're probably going to capture just a few words out of their conversation because it's such a specialty, and it's words that it's not on a daily basis that we hear, that we're used to hearing, let alone understand. And so most definitely walking into a classroom that spoke about technical terms, such as medical terms, medical procedures, and then having to transfer that into another language and finding the appropriate equivalent into the other language, that was a challenge in and of itself. So it was basically first understanding it in your what we call source language, and then identifying the equivalent into the target language. So it's a lot of work, and it's definitely, like I mentioned earlier, it's definitely intentional because it's not jargon you speak on a daily, so it's a lot of memory retention too.
Could you just walk through, let's say, like an average day as an interpreter when you were at the hospital?
I'll utilize the experience at the children's hospital because only because I feel that my best experience and where I understood what a wraparound service was for the interpreter was at the children's hospital, and I'll explain a little further. So when I started working as a professional interpreter, everything you learn in the classroom in theory, you think that everybody knows this information wherever you're going to go work at, right? You think everyone already knows this information. This is how naive we are. We're just excited to go through the schooling. Everyone knows how to work with a professional or a trained interpreter. So I walk into the general hospital, and there was some understanding, but not complete understanding, meaning that the nurse would still say, explain this document to the patient. And then she'd walk out, and I'd say, excuse me, you're not supposed to walk out and leave me here. I don't, if they have questions, I don't know the answers to that. So we get trained that we're not supposed to be left in a patient's room by ourselves for that very reason, because then the patient, imagine, oh, you speak my language, right? And so they get going into stuff that we don't know anything about, or we shouldn't know. And so that was kind of the experience in the general hospital. This is where I first realized, yeah, it's not the same. They teach us one thing, and then real life, it's a different thing. But then when I made my way into the children's hospital, this was an experience where I realized that they've got a wraparound service for the service in general. What I mean by that is that they've got a call system, just like, because it's a large hospital. So if there's a need for anything, let's say they need a gurney, the call center will, locate the service and then send out the gurney to wherever it needs to go, right? That was basically, in essence, the same thing for the interpreter, something we did not have at the general hospital. The general hospital was like, we were working in the departments, and so we would get paged. There was a little pager that, we'd get paged and we'd run to our assignment. The children's hospital, we also had pagers, but it was more uniformed. there were many interpreters on site. All of them had had training. The doctors, the professionals there had been trained to work with an interpreter. And one of the first things that I remember that took me aback was that I showed up to the hospital and, or the room, the patient's room, and the doctor and the nurse were standing out there waiting for me to arrive, and they were briefing me. And I thought, oh no, they think I'm someone else, right? And I remember like looking around, like they think I'm one of the other specialists. And then they gave me the quick rundown and then said, are you ready, interpreter? And I was like, so what they're doing is they're giving you context, because as an interpreter, you need context before you walk into the room, terminology, what is the diagnosis and all that, because you're going to need that information. It's super, I mean, we were in the ICU in the children's hospital, so you could only imagine there's some serious stuff going on. That was an experience that stayed just imprinted in my memory, because I remember thinking, these are professionals, other professionals that look at you, the interpreter, the language professional, as another professional, share the information for context so that you know what you're walking into. And they knew how to work with the interpreter, meaning they would say something like, a couple of renditions or utterances, and then they would pause for the interpreter. And then they would look at the patient. They would not look at these are all things we learn in school that providers should do, but not everyone gets that training. Not everyone understands the why. So yeah, day and night, I would get called. It was a very fun and fulfilling job in the sense that I was challenged all the time. There were different departments in the hospital, different specialties. It's a pretty big hospital. And so that means that they provided neurological services. They provided gastrointestinal services. It was all sorts of different specialties. So every call that I got, I knew it was going to be something completely different. There was no same department. Whereas to the general hospital, I worked in labor and delivery. And while that was, fun in the sense that there was never a dull moment running around, there's a lot of babies being born, it was the same terminology over and over. And the children's hospital was not. Completely different. I'd get paged, I'd go to one department, come back, sometimes get paged after I was done with that one. And the person where the centralized services was happening knew where you were at each time. So they knew if I had checked out of that assignment, that I was now open to send me to a new one. So, it was just very well put together. Mm-hmm.
What was the longest conversation that you had to interpret when you were at the hospital?
At the hospital, it was an end of life. So this is basically where the doctor is informing the patient's family that the child is about to take their last breath. And so, it's basically in preparation. So it was long in the sense that we weren't there for a long time interpreting, but there was a lot of pauses, I'm sure you can imagine, in between, allowing the family to process the information, and then so that they could ask the questions needed, things like that. A long one in terms of actual time would be the actual presentation of diagnosis to the patient, in which there's all the different specialty doctors that are there, and they are explaining the diagnosis of the patient to the family, to the parents. It was a children's hospital, so the patient was always a child. That was pretty long because of all the specialties, if it's one problem, one diagnosis, but that diagnosis is several things, right? There's several things in one. There's different specialty doctors that are there informing the parents of what is going on with the child. Yeah. Yeah, pretty intense. Like a lot. Children's Hospital was pretty intense. It was no joke. And I think that if I had the opportunity to be there full time as a full-time employee, I would have stayed there, just because it's I mean, like I said, there's such a high need, and it was challenging all the time. So it wasn't boring at all, to say the least. Yeah, not at all. Yeah.
And I think I've heard before that there's different types of interpreting as far as I can't remember the words right now.
Yeah, yeah, there is.
Like a
Well,
delayed kind of response, you know what I mean?
yeah. So they're called modes of interpreting and community
Modes.
interpreting, which is, in essence, it's like this big umbrella term for a lot of the services that are provided in the community, right? Medical included, and the modes of interpreting are consecutive. That's what your average person potentially knows. They may not know the name to it, but they may be familiar with it, which is where the speaker pauses and allows the opportunity for the interpreter to give their rendition. So that's called consecutive, right? There's pauses
Okay.
in between. There's short and there's long consecutive, because you've seen it. Like if you ever watched when the president is speaking to a foreign politician and there's somebody behind them taking notes, that's your interpreter. And then they go on forever. Those interpreters are amazing. Those are like the best of the best, because they're just note takes after note taking up like pages and pages. That's your long consecutive. That's not really something we necessarily encounter in community interpreting, but that's what most people are familiar with. Then there's a simultaneous. These are the individuals that a lot of people think of maybe when the United Nations come together and they're all speaking, and you see some politicians with their headphones on, they're listening to an interpreter in real time. And so the interpreter is speaking at the same time, close to the same time that the speaker is speaking. They're giving their rendition. There's no pauses there. It's just go, go,
Okay.
go, which is typically why you see more than one interpreter in one booth, because they take turns.
Oh wow. Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, you have to take turns. Otherwise it's like you, like me, even if you as an individual, you speak for a long time, your throat gets dry, you've got to clear your
Yes.
throat, you need breaks. Yeah. Not to mention the brain, what happens to the brain if you're doing that for too long. But yeah, there's definitely fatigue involved with that mode for sure.
Okay. Then at the hospital, which one were you mostly using? Which
Consecutive.
modes?
There was a lot
Consecutive.
of, while there was a lot of information given, it was always given in a dialogue way in which they would allow for processing of the information by the parents, and then for the opportunity to ask questions. And so because the setting was a setting of dialogue to be able to go back and forth between people, the consecutive mode is typically, that's generally just your rule of thumb, where we'll begin with that mode. You have the opportunity, if you're trained, to mode switch, what they call, if needed, but I never needed to do that. And in the hospital, there was never a moment where it was like a dump of information in which I needed to simultaneously interpret. I did do that after, when I made a transition into K through 12 public education, but that's different.
Okay. And then did you have to take a lot of notes as well when you were interpreting?
Absolutely. Yes, that's a must.
That's a must.
Consecutive interpreting and the notebook, it goes hand in hand. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people that have excellent memory retention, but no matter how good you are, you've got to write things down. Think of number sequences, date of births, addresses, things like that you don't have to necessarily memorize. You could write it down so that your rendition or what you're hearing goes a little longer, because you're not so focused on retaining maybe a number sequence. You wrote it down, but you're listening to the rest of that message. And so there's techniques to that, but note taking is definitely a must for interpreting, especially consecutive interpreting, especially for long consecutive interpreting. Yeah.
And what kind of things were you writing down? Because I assume you weren't trying to write down every single like word that they're saying.
Well, if you're untrained, you do. You
Oh,
do
okay.
write everything down. Make sure I don't forget anything. But no, you're writing things down that are going to prompt your memory, and so it's it's a whole technique, right? You're listening actively, very actively. You're listening to the message. Interpreters don't interpret words. We interpret meaning. We interpret messages. So it's the whole thing, right? And then we render the meaning into another language, in a way that's understandable to the other party. So I don't mean we change register, or we keep it all the same, but obviously, languages differ, right? In sequence and things like that. And so we listen and we jot down, or I jot down things that are going to prompt my memory. So it could be, hey, this part was an exclamation point. This part was a question, right? This statement was a question. There's technique in note taking, and that's a whole separate course from just the interpreting aspect. So
Okay.
you're writing things down that are prompting memory, and it's not word for word. It could be words, it could be acronyms. That it's basically the general rule is that the less pin strokes there are, the better, right? You're wanting to write as less terminology as possible, and that's why a lot of the times all you see is gibberish on an interpreter's notebook. What seems like gibberish, it's not to the interpreter, but it could be symbols. It's like hieroglyphics that you end up writing because it means something to the interpreter. But all we're doing is writing things down to prompt our memory. Memory is really what we're relying on more than note taking, which is why it's not shorthand. It's not the same thing as what a transcriber in the court setting does. Note taking for the interpreter is very personalized, and it's only to prompt memory, not to write everything down.
Okay. So could you explain what a transcriber does in court interpreting?
I could do my best. I'm not by any means a transcriber myself, but they do training as well. So that's the person that's sitting there taking down everything that is being said in court. They're transcribing basically, short of like the machine right now that if you speak into it creates, the subtitles or, the closed captioning, right? AI does that. That's basically who your transcriber is, but they are jotting down word for word. Now imagine word for word, impossible, right? And so they utilize shorthand, which is a very specific technique in order to capture word for word. So, kudos to them, and I'm sure that I missed something in there. But that in a nutshell, that is really what they're doing, which is completely different to what the interpreter is doing. We're relying more on the short-term memory than the notes, whereas to the transcriber, it's strictly all notes. This is where they get the transcription of what was said in that court hearing, and for the most part, it's verbatim. I mean, from the stuff that I've read, but then their stuff has to be translated, right? So all their stuff needs to be translated into actual English language. So, yeah, different, completely different. Mm-hmm.
And let's talk a little bit about the physical aspect of being an interpreter and the emotional aspect of it as well. Because just from you talking about this experience and what you have to do, it sounds extremely intensive, and I'm already tired just thinking about it. So what is that part like?
The emotional aspect of being an interpreter really does depend on the setting. In my particular experience, working at that children's hospital was, for the most part, pretty intensive cases. Because they, like I mentioned, they're one of the best hospitals on this side of the states that offers services to children with pretty severe cases. And so it was unique just in the setting itself, but in the conversations as well. When I worked in the general hospital and was assigned to the labor and delivery, generally speaking, it's always good. It's always good news. There were occasions where it was not, but they were very far few in between. Whereas to the children's hospital, you could have at least one really severe case every day that you worked. So it does take a toll emotionally. As a trained interpreter, you are trained to separate yourself from the situation. But I think that my counterparts, colleagues, could say that there's only so much you can separate or try to separate from the situation until it basically, affects you. There is such a thing as, the trauma that occurs to the interpreter as a result of all the information that they're absorbing. So a technique that is utilized in interpreting is the first person conversation. And so when we speak in first person, we are absorbing the communication as if it were our own. So say, for instance, you say, I'm not feeling well and I've been feeling like this for 3 days. The interpreter will say, I'm not feeling well and I've been feeling like this for 3 days. The interpreter, the trained interpreter, does not say, Joshua says that he's been feeling sick and that he's not been feeling well for 3 days. So we internalize that in the sense of, we're claiming it as if it were our own, because your voice is my voice is your voice as the patient. And so, imagine day in and day out of that. It does cause, I'm not going to say it can, it does cause trauma if the interpreter doesn't know how to basically do things to support them mentally and physically and separate them from the experience. We're very much involved, and you do tend to internalize it because of the I factor, right? And so, well, there's no science behind that, but I mean, if we think about it, right, there's plenty of research done with how situations like this affects the interpreter. And I'm trying to think of the actual phrase that's called, I don't know why I can't think of it right now, but there's an actual term for it, which basically in essence means it's trauma that is caused to the interpreter as a result of, the difficult encounters, and not releasing that, not having a way to go and release that somehow. Mm-hmm.
Wow. And then if there's any stories of interpreters who have endured this trauma and then they've actually had to stop being an interpreter because they weren't able to handle it or they didn't know how to deal with it?
Yes, I've actually have had guests on the show that do speak about the fact that they didn't realize how it was affecting them and how the stories were affecting them. And so they worked and worked and worked until one day that one case kind of took them over, like it basically was the last straw, right? In terms of having like an anxiety attack, or, just it manifested physically only because there was so much information that had been taken down or absorbed by the interpreter that ultimately ended up affecting them. There's one story in particular where he speaks about being an over the phone interpreter, and there were a lot of stories that would come through, or a lot of cases that would come through over the phone, but one in particular that was very impactful because it had to do with domestic violence and suicide. And so he absorbed that, but it shocked him because of what happened. It was a 911 call that he was interpreting for. And so, from the beginning to the end, and then it was like he was done with the call, but it left him in this shock mode, and he didn't do anything about it. And so as the days went by and he kept getting cases, it's almost like the aftermath really of, a collection of trauma stories all this negativity. And at some point he just cracked, and he, was manifesting in a way that he didn't want to go to work anymore. He had anxiety getting a phone call such as that again, right? Like it would manifest, and he'd get anxious. All of that his body was doing on its own without him thinking about it. And it turns out that it was because he was having, this, I don't know why I can't think of the word, but, he was having this trauma that was affecting him as a result of his past experiences, because there was no one he was speaking with about them so that he could let them go, or doing anything for himself so that he could release that tension and that anxiety. So, I mean, it can definitely affect the individual. We're there interpreting, but yet we are part of the experience in a way.
Yeah, there's a lot more to it than just trying to interpret from one language to another. It seems like
Yeah,
more involved.
it's not just speaking, that's for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, there's a lot of emotional connection to it, and there can be. I think that for the most part, many language professionals begin their careers in this profession because it's a way of giving back to the community, because we want to help. And so we do things with that, with the heart really leading. And then you get involved in situations like this. And one of the first things that you're taught is that as an interpreter, you've got to abide by your role boundaries and the professionalism, and you can't get involved as you would a bilingual individual and say, hey, let me advocate for you. No, don't do that, or no, don't say that, or how about you should ask this question. You can't do that as a trained interpreter. So you kind of get left with that feeling of like, oh, I wish they would say this, or I wish they would say that, and that you're left with that. So it's a challenge, most definitely, to say the least.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely sounds like that.
Yeah.
And I've heard you say different types of interpreting. I don't know if there's like an actual word for it, but I've heard, I think, community interpreting thus far, court interpreting, then also medical interpreting. What other types of interpreting are there, and any types of like specializations or anything like
Oh
that?
yeah. There's like the specializations, and then there's the subspecializations, and then there's niches. And I mean, it's like that. This is why the language professional industry is so beautiful. It's because you don't have to stick with just one thing. Let's say, for instance, Joshua, you don't like the consecutive, you don't want to deal with the note taking, but you do like professional development. Let's say that that's the topic that you just really enjoy, and you like simultaneous. And so, as an interpreter, you can be a simultaneous interpreter that only focuses on interpreting for the individuals that are going out there having conferences on professional development. Let's say it's an author that, you really like, and they're out there now doing their little, roadshow for their book, and they're having conferences with guests, and you could be their interpreter. Or you're really into politics and you want to interpret for all the different politicians that are out there having public forums and things like that. You can interpret and specialize just in that. So now you're a simultaneous interpreter specializing in political conferences or things like that. So I mean, there's like so many different specialties. You do have the community, but within the community interpreting, there's specialties with that. We've got individuals that are experts in church interpreting, and so they could be having mass in English, but then there's the interpreter somewhere in some booth or in some area interpreting the mass into another language. You've got the educational interpreters. That's a specialty in public education, where we're interpreting not for the student, but for the parents or the families of the students that speak another language. There's the medical interpreting as well. These could be clinics. There's immigration interpreting. I mean, there's interpreting all over the place. So it just really depends on what you really like. I think that a lot of individuals that begin their journey think of it just as one, we think of it as it's just interpreting, meaning just it's one category. But if you look at it like, say, for instance, you could be a doctor of general medicine. So you see a little bit of everything, right? But you don't really specialize in anything. Or you could be a medical surgeon, a heart surgeon. Even in surgery, there's specialties, so it's the same concept for interpreting. You could specialize in something specific, like simultaneous, let's say, but then you are conference interpreting for the sciences. For instance, I'll give you a quick example. Somebody called me one day and said, "Hey, Mireya, would you be interested in interpreting simultaneous conference, interpreting?" I was like, "Wow, that'd be a great opportunity. What's the topic?" "Oh, it's archaeology. They just discovered some mummies out in I don't know what, and so they're about to present this to the." I don't know anything about archaeology. By next weekend, I'm not going to be able to prepare, and I've never in my life have spoken into the target language about mummies. So while it sounds super interesting to hear, interpreting in that, specific area, because it's such a particular, that's terminology that's very specific to them. I have to be professional enough to say, well, it's a great opportunity. That's not my area of expertise. And so they have to go with another Spanish speaking interpreter whose area of expertise is archaeology. Wasn't for me.
So I can see that while you were in the children's hospital, the general hospital, you had, I'll say, kind of like your clients or your interpreting jobs within the hospital itself. Mm-hmm. So now you're getting jobs from other people, or is it organization?
Yeah. So what ended up happening is I ended up going from the children's hospital into public education. So there happened to be a position that was full time, and followed more of the school's, well, not followed more, like it followed the school schedule because they were a school. They were a school district. And it just so happened that at the time, that's exactly what I needed. I needed a little bit more structure in my schedule. The hospital, as it turns out, never closes. So we're like rotating, schedules. I could be there at night. I could be early morning. I could be there on the weekends. It was just, you were scheduled as you were scheduled on the rotating shift. Whereas the school district, provided or offered a bit more of a schedule that I can count on. I knew when I was going to be on. I knew when I was going to be off. So I ended up making the transition into the school setting, dedicated the last 10 years of my professional career in public education as an internal in-house interpreter and translator. And once I launched the podcast and, it developed, one thing led to another, I started meeting individuals outside of that particular niche and more specifically that particular community, because I belong to a community and in the school district, and I didn't really navigate outside of that until 2 years ago. And so now it's more of a, when it comes to show you what the power of networking does, that I started to connect with other professionals in the industry, and that's how people know you or get to know you and what you specialize in, by simply networking and talking with other individuals. And the podcast allowed me the opportunity. So that's why I get people that now that they know that I exist and what my working languages are, and what I can, what modes of interpreting I can do, people connect with you to see if you would be interested to work with them or if you would be interested in an assignment. So it's definitely different. Yeah, it's different. They might get a request to interpret and realize that they need a booth mate, or somebody to help them, when you need 2 interpreters because it's going to be long or intensive or whatever the specifications are. And they'll think of you for the assignment or for the opportunity.
Wow.
Yeah.
And did you have to take any extra courses or have to study a lot more or get certified again for the translation portion of it? I know before, and you said interpreting and translation are kind of 2 separate things.
2 completely separate things. So the interpreting, for your audience that didn't realize up until this moment that existed, interpreting is the oral aspect of transferring language. So this is the spoken. These are your spoken interpreters that you hear them, you see them speaking. That's your spoken language interpreter. That's interpreting. Translation is converting language from one language to another in written form. And so your translators, so your favorite book whose author is foreign, there was a translator behind that. They translated that, not just the words, but the story and the emotions. And I mean, they're specialties even for translation. And yes, when you go through the program, this particular program that I went through, there was no specialization. It was like a combination of different specialties, if you will, because I had interpreting and then I had my legal course, and then I had interpreting and I had my medical course, and then I had a few, like 2 classes in the program that had to do with translation. So I was, I was what's the word, introduced to translation, but I knew that translation was not my thing. I wanted to do the talking part. I didn't want to do the writing part. And I shared with you why, that for me was not my forte. And so I ended up choosing going more on the interpreting side. It just so happened that later in the school district, that's what they needed. And so I had to force myself to take continuing education so that what I was producing, it was, to a certain standard. And of course, utilizing my resources, which in this particular case is a very strong translator that we had in-house. And so I always made sure that she reviewed my work prior to sending it out. Poor her.
Wow. Mm-hmm. And what was interpreting like when you went to the educational space?
A mess. I'm sorry. A mess. I'm going to be quite frank. And I say a mess compared to where I was coming from. Remember, the Children's Hospital was like, wow. Like, there was a model for language access services for their families. It just, it demonstrated how powerful when put together correctly, it can be for everyone involved in the service. And then I went to the school district and it was like, that's not the same thing. Like, interpreting and translating are 2 separate. It was just day and night. And so going into that, of course, I didn't know that. Again, I was still with this mentality that people understood the difference, especially if they were recruiting for the position. I thought that they understood the difference. And it wasn't until I entered that setting that I quickly realized that that was not the case. Working for an organization where there are hundreds of employees that you will potentially be working with, and hundreds of families as well, there's so many different dynamics at play. And so it was a steep learning curve, excuse me, in the sense that I had to come to the realization that there was no system in place to support the interpreter and translator, in addition to no systems in place to support the families that spoke a language other than English. And so there was just it was a very monstrous project, or just what I had embarked on was something completely different. And that took me to a whole different journey for my language professional journey. It was completely different.
For whatever reason, in my head, I thought being an interpreter within a hospital would be a lot more chaotic and not organized whatsoever. But like when you're doing interpreting in K through 12 schools, it'd be a lot easier. I don't know why I thought that, but
I think it's the general consensus. To be honest, I think when people think about excuse me, when people think about medical interpreting, I think that or in a hospital setting, yeah, you think about all the running around and everything because of what we see on the front end, right? As patients, when we go in there, what we see, there's a lot of movement, and I can't say that the experience that I had at the Children's Hospital is the experience that anyone will have at any hospital, because it just depends on the systems and the processes that they've put together. Remember, I came from a general hospital, and that was not my experience at the general hospital in terms of just the systems that they had created in the Children's Hospital. It was totally different. I loved the structures that they had implemented. And many people do tend to think that educational interpreting is easy. And it turns out that out of all the different experiences that I had, the educational interpreting is where I applied most of the things that I learned in school, such as the different types of modes of interpreting. I applied all of them all the time at the school setting. Many people didn't, or me included, didn't realize or don't realize how much technical jargon there is in education, that as teachers, as specialists, as administrators, school administrators, you speak on that all the time. And so it seems normal. But for someone that is not in that setting all the time, so let's say, Joshua, you've got a child that is in special education, let's just say that as an example, and you are meeting with the teacher or an administrator that is going to talk to you about the services that are going to be offered in the assessments. They begin to talk in a language that you thought you understood, but then it's so technical, right? We're going to begin this IEP with the psychological assessment and all the results and the battery of tests that we just conducted to the child, including speech and language pathology. And then it's just, you're like, in English, you're like, wait, I'd slow it down just a little bit. And I did not catch any of that. So a lot of people, there's a big misconception that educational interpreting isn't as challenging, when the reality is it's just as challenging as other specialties.
Have you ever had any parents that would get angry at you for, during a little interpreting session for whatever reason? Because they're angry at the situation,
Because they're angry at the situation. I was fortunate that in the 10 years that I was with the school district, the only time that I actually had a parent address me, the interpreter, was when he didn't understand that. So I mentioned it quickly earlier. It's called mode switching, right? And so I'm interpreting in simultaneous mode when the administrator is speaking. It was an expulsion hearing. So they have this process in order for the student. They're going to determine whether or not they're going to expel the student from the school district. And so, we're having this hearing, and there's a moment where families get to address the panel. And so when I'm interpreting for panel members to the parent, it's in simultaneous. But when the parent is going to speak, because parents don't tend to have experience of speaking at the same time somebody else is speaking, right? That kind of it doesn't go just for families, it goes for other individuals as well. But particularly for our families, we switch modes. And so we listen, we take down notes, and then we give our interpretation, right? We wait for a pause so that we can begin. And so he was a little upset that I wasn't interpreting at the same time like he had heard me do for them. It wasn't until he realized, because he turned around and he looked at me, he's like, "You're going to interpret for me or what?" Right? In Spanish. ¿Me va a interpretar o qué? And then when he looked down, he realized I was jotting down information. So then, he quickly went back and continued what he was telling the panel. So that's the only moment that I kind of really had, in terms of a parent being upset directly at me. But I think it's only because he had not realized what was going on. He just heard silence. So that was a little fun in the sense that, then once he realized I was actually indeed, taking down notorious notes, then he was like, "Oh, okay, never mind, sorry."
And how do you prepare for your interpreting sessions? I don't know. Are they called interpreting sessions, or I don't know, or assignments, I guess?
assignments, encounters. I think everybody has their own little, word for it. But there's a lot of preparation involved. That's another part of the training that a lot of people potentially don't even realize that must occur before you walk into an assignment. So remember the experience at the Children's Hospital before walking into that patient's room and the medical staff giving me some context. That in essence is the ideal situation, that before you walk into the actual encounter, you already have information before walking in. That includes terminology, context, the direction in which the conversation might go. And it all differs what you ask for. It just depends on the type of assignment you have. So if I'm going to have a presentation, then I'm going to be asking for, do you have slides, right? Do you have a PowerPoint presentation? Is there a script that's written? Are you going to address the public in a certain way? So depending on what I'm going to be interpreting for, really dictates what I'm going to be asking for. So in the school setting, there was a lot of educational meetings, a lot of it having to do with a child's learning environment. And for that, the staff must take copious notes in order to be able to transfer those to the child's file, the cumulative file if needed. And so there's a lot of note taking involved, and there's a lot of understanding generally what the student is going to need. So they can share that information with the interpreter. So the interpreter comes in with an understanding of, is there a medical diagnosis? What types of supports are going to be given? What is like the main challenge that the student is having? And all of that just gives for a better interpretation in the sense that you don't get stuck on a term, your mind isn't going like, what the heck does that mean? Like, yeah. So it just, it
Does
helps.
that happen a lot?
In terms
Getting stuck on a term and like, oh, you can't remember something or...
Oh yeah, I mean that's we're not walking dictionaries, so that's why preparation is so important, because if you don't understand a term, let's say that you don't have its equivalent to quickly render its equivalent to the target language, then you have to, and this goes with training, you have to know how to go around that. So say for instance, when you're reading a book and you come across a term that you hadn't maybe seen before and you don't know what it means, but the context around that word gives you an idea of what that word might mean, so that you understand the message and you don't lose the message because of that one word. It's the same notion with interpreting. Because of that one term, you've got to be actively listening and understand the context so that one term doesn't throw you off or your message off completely. You have to learn how to work around that. But context is what's going to allow you for that. So this is why we say we don't interpret word for word. That's not what interpreting entails. We interpret messages, so that one word is not going to. Now, if the word is significant, then there's techniques. If it's important, let's say it's a medical diagnosis that they want, or a concern that may have to do with a medical issue, and that medical term is important. We have to say that. Then there are techniques that we can utilize during the session, so that we can ask for a clarification or the opportunity to look up the term if needed. If the moment does not allow for that, we can help explain the term. So we'll ask, the interpreter would like to request an explanation of the term, whatever that may be. Because I don't have its equivalent to it right now. Right? That's not exactly how I would say it, but just so that the other person understands, oh yeah, sure. So what I mean by that is, and now they're giving the explanation and I can interpret the explanation. But then, on the back end, what happens is the interpreter is like writing down what that word was because shoot, I missed it. Yeah. So there's technique to all of that. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds like definitely a science.
Yeah. The other interpreters will tell you, or you'll wake up in the middle of the night with the rendition, like, that's what it was. Ya para qué?
All right. Now I want to know what is your advice for someone who wants to, actually, no, let me ask this question first. Do you think it is possible for someone to let's say, learn Spanish right now, they're a native English speaker as an adult, and then become an interpreter?
I think anything is possible for an individual that wants to do anything they set their minds to. It's just how much emphasis you put into whatever that may be. It takes a little longer, of course, as an adult, only because of, in life, everything that we are already doing. Maybe learning isn't as quickly as it once used to be. So I think that's why it takes a little longer. But I think the beauty of this situation with interpreting and the languages is that once you have the language down, that once you really feel like there is fluency in that language, the interpreting component, it's a learned skill set, it's a skill. Like all skills, it's learned. And so you can add that learned skill in addition to your tool that you already have in languages. And any training that you go to, there's going to be you're going to get assessed, and so that program will determine whether or not you have the fluency in order to be able to add that additional skill set. So yes, I do believe that if the individual is adamant that this is what they want to do with that other language, not just have the language for the sake of having conversation with someone, but they want to utilize that in a way that is professional, in a professional setting, that they can add that to their toolbox because it's a learned trait.
Okay, that's good to know. Very motivating.
Right? If a Spanglish speaker was able to do it, it's like we can definitely, it can definitely be utilized in a professional way, for sure. And I think that it all depends. Remember earlier when I said there's different settings. You could even think of it in that way. So you begin with the setting that is maybe not as challenging, but the terminology you can pick up. And you're able to transfer messages in a setting that is not like you're not in court, you're not in a conference, you're not speaking with political delegates, anything like that. You're not going to go maybe that route to begin with, but you will start in a setting in which you can volunteer your services, and it's not something that's dire, right? It's not someone's life isn't at stake, or educational, decisions aren't at stake, or things of that nature. See, so you can begin in a setting that is not so intense and get the practice done and get the fluency. And I think more than anything, getting that confidence in yourself, because a lot of people don't talk about that, but I think that is definitely part of the process, is building your confidence in yourself so that you can take on new challenges and improve in your skill set.
Okay, now to add on to that, what would you recommend someone like me or someone who's in the audience right now who is a Spanish learner? And I know a lot of us, we're adults trying to, learn Spanish, or we're coming back to learning Spanish after taking, Spanish classes in middle school, high school, and college. And, we still have a very big learning curve ahead of us when it comes to just to learning the language. And then on top of that, wanting to become an interpreter or a translator, like what exactly should we do to accomplish this?
I think it's getting comfortable with that language. So in addition to understanding language, I think culture is very much a conversation to be had, that two and two go together. So I always go back to this term because I feel like it's really what drives everything, or rather improves everything, which is context. So language is language is by itself, but when you mix that with the culture of that language, it makes it richer, and it gives you a better understanding and meaning, even meaning for a term, right? That maybe that meaning behind it doesn't exist in the English language, but it exists in that other language. And that could only have come with a mix of the culture. And so the recommendation, I would say, would be to get involved, right? And become a part of that if it's Spanish that you're learning, Joshua, that there's different Spanishes. There's not just one Spanish. So even just in the culture, of being able to watch TV shows that are in that language that you enjoy, get to know what those nuances are that you wouldn't pick up in a classroom setting or in a textbook. It puts character, I think, into the language, and I think that's really it's what makes the language alive. And I say that only because I feel that once you get into this rhythm of the language, if you will, then that's when you feel like you're ready to throw in something else. So in interpreting or translation, you're in the rhythm with that. Now you feel like I want to utilize it in this aspect and see if I can get my point across. But the only way to do that is by practicing it. So it's like immerse yourself in the practice of it in real life situations, so that you're having conversations, so that when someone says something in the language, in your target language, that you typically wouldn't understand, it's like, well, that's a culture thing though, see? So it's like, it's different, there's emphasis to that. We do that in English all the time. A lot of people learn the English language and then we cut off words, we take off letters from a word, and they're like,
oh yeah.
what do you mean by that? Or even the humor, right, in it.
Yeah.
What are you saying? So it's the same way in whatever other language you're learning. That's why I feel it's so important to just mix yourself with the people that are speaking that language. I've heard this time and time from guests, and they learn German in the classroom, and then they set sail to, well, not really sail, but they go off to like Germany, and they did well enough to maybe just catch the ticket on a train to wherever they're going, and then they get off at the location and they're trying to have a conversation with the people, and the people are like, what are you speaking? And you realize all those years I don't speak it. I don't really speak the language. That's because they've not mixed the culture into it, which I think that's really what amplifies the experience. Did I answer your question?
Yes, that answered my question. And that's exactly what happened to me when I went to Mexico and the Dominican Republic. It's just like I don't know Spanish at all.
But then I think there's a different appreciation to it, when that happens. Even just in watching, I know that I love watching foreign shows they do have subtitles because I do want to know what's being said, but just in the way and their humor is like our humor, or, it's like, I get what they're, like that pun or something, because I understand the humor behind it, or it's just different. It hits different, I think, when there's culture infused into it. That's why I'm always saying, just go out there and people appreciate it. I could not tell you how many times a principal that was trying to connect with the families in their school by means of just saying one phrase in Spanish, and they practiced it so much so that they could get that across to the families, especially during COVID times. You've no idea the appreciation that those families felt for that particular principal, just because she tried to connect, and they embraced her so much more, like literally and figuratively. They just embraced her so much more as part of, the community, the school community with their kids, just because she was trying. And people love the fact that you try. Like, I've yet to meet someone that says, "Oh, you're silly," trying to speak our language. Like, no, it's like, "Oh, you speak it." I mean, then you need a disclaimer, of course, because then they just want to speak, and you're like, "Okay, I don't speak it that fluently yet."
Absolutely. And are there any resources of course, your podcast, but like websites for those who are interested in learning more about the interpreting industry and being a language profession?
Yes, I would say start with the podcast. No, my particular podcast, one of the things that I really appreciate about it, not to toot my own horn, is because it does share the journeys of other language professionals, and they share the resources that have helped them. So it is packed with that, that part of their stories in which they share their own resources and what has helped them. But I think it just really depends on if you're looking for training, let's say, what schooling you want to go through. If you want to do university level training, do you want to do, workshops? Because there are also online like 40-hour programs that you can take to kind of get you, that basic level training. Like the minimum is what we call kind of getting you a foot in the door, a taste of what it's like, getting some of that basic level training. So there's programs out there online that you can also take that are very, very basic in nature, but enough to give you that understanding that you need of what it really takes to be a language professional. But yeah, I mean, online, I would say it depends on what you're interested in, right? Do you want to do community? Do you want to do court interpreting? Do you want to do conference? Do you want to specialize in something specifically? I mean, I think the sky's the limit when it comes to that. Many people don't understand that the language industry is even an industry, but it most definitely is. And you can tap into any topic that you'd like. It just, you kind of have to be clear as to where you want to start.
Yeah. That sounds like probably the most difficult part.
I always felt it was like the most difficult part. Just where do I begin? And I would say, I mean, if you're ready to take on that opportunity, that challenge, that you do start with training, most definitely, because like many of us, sometimes we go to the program and realize, thanks to the exposure of what it's going to be like, that this is not what we want to do. So, you could find that out. Like I found that out day one in my, in classroom, and I'm like, I don't speak Spanish. This, this is challenging. I like it, right? Because I went through the training. Whereas if I had just plugged myself into a situation to interpret, in my mind, I'm doing great. When in actuality, I really wasn't. So, but the learning aspect gave me the opportunity to identify that. So I would say start with some training, even if it's basic. There's conferences, there's webinars. Plug yourself into online. If you do social media, follow the hashtags that people are utilizing in the industry so that you can get exposed to what's happening. Webinars, things like that.
Okay, that's a good idea.
That's another approach. That's how I find my hairstylist, through hashtags.
Okay, let's dive into your podcast a little bit more now. So, what made you start your podcast, and what is your podcast all about?
The podcast was, oh my goodness, that's a whole other story in and of itself. It really, if I could, just narrow it down, it was a creative outlet. I was at a point in my career where I felt like I could do more, and I didn't know what more I could do. I'd been with the school district for 10 years, a little over 10 years at that point, and I had kind of hit the peak as far as where I could go in that particular organization. So, many people out there could maybe consider that the same thing has happened to them, which is I was getting bored. I was getting bored. That's really what it came down to, and I needed a creative outlet. And so I knew that I love learning. I love learning from other people's stories. I was already a podcast listener. Like I listen to podcasts all the time because I enjoy, just the learning. I had a long commute. And so this was my learning time for me. So whether it were audiobooks or podcasts, and one thing led to another where I made this crazy decision one day that why not a podcast is what that was really like how it all started. And just like the experience of school where I was like, I'm being challenged and therefore I'm learning and therefore this makes it fun. Learning how to put together a podcast was the same exact experience where it was like I was lost in time, right? And just trying to learn how to even begin, and what topics would I cover, who would I interview, what would the layout be like. I mean, all of those questions, and I was like, I was in a trance, basically. That's all I could, put it down to be. I was in a trance because it was just like one thing led to another, and then I hit publish. And that's
important. That's important.
Because a lot of people might get to the point where it's like, yeah, I'm going to do this, but they never hit publish for one thing. And I just, I hit publish. And I mean, it's wild because the podcast has only been out for a little over 2 years. It's almost going to be 3 years. I started the podcast. I published my first episode in February of 2020, and in March, so the next month, we were in lockdown. And so it became my passion project, if you will, that kind of took me away from what was happening out there and all that. And it gave me the opportunity to really focus in on it. And, because I wasn't commuting anymore. And so I was working, but it was like, check in, check out. There was no 2-hour drive anymore. I could dedicate that time to my passion project. And I don't know if it was because of the pandemic. I can't tell you, but all I know is that the interpreting community embraced it. They embraced the stories of other individuals that were willing to come on and share some of their most vulnerable moments, whether it was personal moments or professional moments. And it's just been, it keeps growing. It's pretty much, it's going strong, and I couldn't be more happy about it. Yeah.
Would you say that hearing the stories and the experiences of the translators, interpreters that you have on your podcast have made you a better translator and interpreter?
Oh, without a doubt. And I think it's also allowed me the opportunity to embrace part of the industry that maybe I thought, or I hadn't thought about in terms of everything that's out there, right? And what a big impact we're doing when we look at the big picture in terms of how we are helping or supporting. We work in silos for the most part. Language professionals, it tends to be a pretty lonely job because you work on your own for the most part. But when you connect with others and you get a sense of you are part of that bigger picture, it just, I often think of it like, so those new pictures that just came out with, how big our galaxy is, and then, how they zone in and the little speck of Earth that's like, on this picture, but then it's like we're part of this even bigger picture. That's kind of how I see us as individuals. We're like but a speck, but then we're part of this whole amazing, huge worldwide network of language professionals. And it doesn't matter if you're out in Japan or in Egypt, the profession is the profession, and we're all experiencing something similar, right? And so you might be out there in the future, I tell them, because they're like 8 hours ahead or something. And you experience something, and then it trickles down to us, and we're able to learn from that experience. So it's just opened up. It basically allowed me the opportunity to put our profession under a microscope, if you will, and then kind of look at it in a different way, from a different angle, and much, much closer. So, yeah, I love the podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's
I love the guests,
amazing.
I should say. They're the podcast. If the guest didn't say yes, then I'd be kind of stuck. I think I would have ended in episode 3 or something, because I would have run out of things to talk about. But it's because, people are willing to come out and share their stories. I think that's what's made it what it's grown to be.
Do you have a favorite story that you have heard thus far? That might be very challenging.
I know, right? I know, because
so many.
when they ask me, I'm always like, all of them are my favorite, but I feel like I'm very like I like the when people introduce other things into their conversation that it's not necessarily just strictly about the language industry. It could be a different passion that they have, and then it kind of joined, right? Like it met in the middle of the road and something new sparked. There's one story that he happens to also be a great storyteller, so I'm sure that helps him a lot. But he speaks about the moment of when he first learned to read, and it's like it stayed with me just because I could see it like a movie. And he's riding the bus, and he realizes that he could read what was on the billboard, because he talks about his dad and how his dad was into music, and that anyway. So learning to read was he wanted to know what all that stuff was in books and things like that. And he's riding on the bus, and he looks outside the window, and he's sounding out the letters in this billboard, and this, there's like a couple of words on there, and he pieces it together, and he says it was like this moment of like a whole new world suddenly just opened, because I knew what it said, and I knew that my life was going to be completely different from that point forward. And he was like 8 or something. And I just thought the story was so beautiful, because it just shows us a little inside, just a little bit about that particular individual. And you can see how these little stories develop in his life. Like it's like whole new worlds open from different, just different in different ways. But that little moment that he shared, it's like it's a premise of what his life continues to be, which is like opening up new worlds in a variety of ways, including learning different languages, because now he has a look into different cultures. I mean, it's just, that's one that stays with me, because he's just such a great storyteller, just, to begin with. But there's all kinds of other ones too. Like, and it has to be the stories where they get to open up. That's what makes, I feel, the podcast different, is that they infuse personality into the conversation. It's not like just an interview, right? It's not like question, answer. They really open up, and they talk about their personal experience. Those are the good stories. Those are like the good episodes I feel, because I'm like, popcorn, please, this is so good. Yeah.
Absolutely. And what would you say is next for Mireya Pérez? What is next, podcast wise, as a language professional, and just in life in general?
Thanks for that question. I tend to think about and plan things, and then nothing turns out the way I planned them. So there's things that actually come about as a result of the work that I'm already doing, if you want to call it work. The projects that I'm working on, I've recently incorporated, and so the podcast started as a show, and it was the name of the podcast, which was the name of a presentation that, there's this whole chain of events that I'm telling you, it's not planned. The name of the podcast was the name of a presentation that I gave, and that I gave that presentation on the push of someone else that was like, you have to talk about, I don't know what you're going to do. I already put you on the agenda. So now you're going to, because I'm not a public speaker, right? Like that was my thing. I'm not a public speaker. I can't, what am I going to talk about? Anyway, so it turns out to be later, like a couple years later, the name of the podcast. And now I've incorporated it because I do have a future plans with what I'd like to expand with that platform. I can see that there is a need for the stories of language professionals, and I do want to expand on that notion that the stories of language professionals deserve a space, and they deserve a space not just in sharing, right? Like the podcast allows me the opportunity, but in really putting it in a way that is not so dull, I guess I can say, where people don't think, oh, language professionals, big deal. That's like language nerds. Like, no. There is some sexiness to this job. There is some attractiveness to this. Like, let me show you. And so it's funny that I say that because recently I've been working on this really huge project that I can't, yet say what it is, but it's like it was sucking my energy away. And in order for me to be able to kind of re-energize, I started doing funny reels about the profession. And it turns out that people are like sharing these things like left and right in their training because they say that it's a different way
Wow.
to present the profession in a way that people, they get entertained and they laugh about it, but they also learn about the profession. That was not my intention, Joshua. Like, I put out reels because I was like, if I don't do this, I'm going to go crazy. This project is, it's such a big project and I got to get this out, but I'm not channeling the creative part right now. And I need that. And one day I put out one reel and all of it, I'm not saying that it's gone like thousands of views or anything like that, but enough to where I thought, wow, this is kind of cool, because I started getting messages about them from individuals that are like, this made my day. Thanks for sharing, or thanks for sharing that this is actually an issue that we face. All I need is one individual, to be appreciative of the content that is put out for me to be like, it's worth it. Yeah. So there's a lot more like that story that I said about opening the door to a whole new world. I think that's in fact what the podcast did for me. It allowed me the opportunity to believe that what I have to share and what I put together has space, there's space for it out there. There's space for everything out there. And yeah, I want to make that grow, and I will make that grow. That is the plan, at least. How that comes to be, I'm not even going to touch on that. I don't want to plan it, because the way things are going, that it naturally happens somehow.
Yeah. And are those Instagram reels or Facebook reels? I just realized that there's Facebook reels like a few days
I
ago.
didn't even know that.
Yeah, I didn't know that until a
Really?
few days ago. Yeah.
I don't know about Facebook. I don't know about Facebook, but I mean, I still post. I do have an account with Facebook, but it's not. It's through Instagram. So those are
Okay.
Instagram reels, the ones that that I've been posting lately. I didn't realize I could share them on Facebook. I don't know if Facebook's interested in reels.
Yeah,
I
I had
mean,
no
the
idea.
audience there. I don't know.
Yeah. And what has been the best piece of advice that you have received from a mentor about being a language professional, interpreter, or translator?
I would definitely say it was about sharing my story. So, for the longest time and up until a couple years, I didn't really think that there was space for my story. Like I said, I always thought it was that space was taken by the people that were the professionals, right? Like those were the people that, they're your star interpreters, like that are out there interpreting for the president or, at the UN, or that are speaking more than two languages. Like it wasn't for me, because I grew up with two languages, so it's not fair, right? In my mind, that's what I was like. I don't count. Like I cheated. But no, I think that the best piece of advice was the fact that someone said, like, if you don't tell your story, who will? And so why not go out there and share it yourself? And, it might make a difference to one person or 20, or you don't know, but you're not going to know unless you go out there and share it. And so I feel that gave me the permission to say, why not? And I did. And what's funny is that I had a teacher that in elementary school, 5th grade, I was about to go into middle school in LA, who saw something that I did not see. And she told me that she felt that I was going to be in communication somehow, and that I needed to tap into that, because she felt, maybe because I talked a lot in class, now that I think about it. I'm putting that 2 and 2 together, right?
That connection.
But yeah, I mean, and look, I mean, I wish I knew where she was, because I would tell her, like, you were absolutely right. But the point of that is that she said, like, you could either be a leader of something good in that area, or you could be a leader of something bad. And ultimately the choice is going to be on you on which direction you want to take this. And so, yeah, that's really what all I'm doing is I'm just out there, putting out truth about what I do or what we do, and enjoying the process.
Yeah, that's amazing. Very inspirational. And what would you say has kept you so motivated to, continue educating yourself and to continue wanting or to continue to be an interpreter despite, all the challenges that you have had to face over the years?
Well, I think the need is there's so much need. There is. I don't think there is enough supply to meet the demand, and languages of all languages. I happen to speak a language that many other people speak, but that there are other languages out there, languages of lesser diffusion that are not going or not receiving the support that they could. And I think the more that we are out there acknowledging that this is a profession and that individuals that speak other languages can absolutely make money, they could get paid to do this, that it eventually reaches those other languages potentially, that an individual might think, well, it's just my second language, right? Like, oh, it's just my second language. But if they're exposed to it as being a profession, that these individuals would want to maybe make the connection and get out there and professionalize so that they can offer the support. So I think for me, it's been realizing that even my small messages can make a big impact on other people's language journeys or professional language journeys. I think that's really what keeps me going. And of course, when people connect with me and share how appreciative they are of the content that I put out, that always motivates me, because sometimes you can go for a long time in silence, and then someone says, I just want to share with you what your content has done for me, and it's like, I can't believe that. Yeah, so it makes it all worth it. Yeah, for sure.
And why should someone be a language professional?
Why? That's a good one. I think that if language has always been something that you are interested in, right? Let's just say it's something that even if you're not interested in, if you have it, like my journey, I didn't really think that I was going to utilize my second language other than to communicate with my family and my dad that insisted on, utilizing the language. I think it has to be born within you to want to utilize the language in a different way. And so if you have that love for language, and then that knack for other things that you could infuse, or combine the language with other likes or other passions in order to create something new. I think that if you want to become a language professional, understand first and foremost that you're going to have to do training, that there's going to be school, you enjoy learning, and you want to find out a new way to utilize your language other than for conversation or for teaching, right? A lot of people are like, I don't want to be a teacher. Then understanding that you can utilize it in different ways and in ways that you can enjoy it. I think that's like my mission right now, is to throw out the information so that people can see you can combine your passions and your love, which includes language, in a way that sparks creativity and that creates something new. If AI is getting into language, why aren't you?
Yeah. And for the audience, how can they learn more about you? And then also, how can they, contact you for any kind of question that they may have?
Yeah, I am on social media, as you heard right now. I am on Instagram, sometimes acting silly, but I do post a lot about the podcast. So on Instagram as Brand the Interpreter, Facebook as well. I just discontinued my Twitter. Too much madness going on there, so I did turn off the Twitter account. I'm trying to get into TikTok, but I don't know if that's my audience. There is a TikTok account that I do share some stuff on there. And then, of course, always feel free to visit the website. There's a contact form there, brandtheinterpreter.com.
Okay,
And
perfect.
yeah, feel free to connect.
And in what different ways can one listen to your podcast, or what different platforms are they on?
Thank you. Yeah, that it really is everywhere. So it's Spotify if you are a Spotify listener, Apple Podcasts if you have an iPhone, you can search for it online and it'll give you all kinds of different results. But if you have Alexa even finds me, so you can ask Alexa to play Brand the Interpreter, and she'll know. She'll find me too. But yeah, it's on any of the podcasting platforms that where people enjoy listening to audio content, Audible included.
Perfect. All right. Thank you very much for joining me today. This has been an absolutely amazing and inspirational conversation. Your experience and your story has been just kind of has blown my mind, honestly. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Joshua, so much for the invitation and for the space to share a little bit about my story. I appreciate you. Thank you.
Absolutely.